She stood at the altar in a white dress that cost $14,000, holding a bouquet of ivory peonies, and a flash drive. The flash drive was the important one, because on it was everything. The emails, the wire transfers, the photographs, the voice recordings, every lie he had ever told, documented over 19 months, by the woman he thought he had already erased. My name is Severine Ashworth, and this is the story of how I lost everything in one night, and took back 10 times more. But before you decide this is a simple revenge story, let me warn you, there is nothing simple about what I did. And there is nothing simple about the man I did it to. Because the worst part, I was still in love with him, even as I watched his empire burn. Let me take you back 3 years. Manhattan. A Thursday evening in early November, when the city had just flipped into that particular kind of cold. Not brutal yet, but sharp enough to remind you that warmth from here on out was something you had to work for. I was 29 years old, and I had just made partner, the youngest in the history of Callaway Vance and Associates, one of New York's most respected financial forensics firms. I had clawed for that title, missed holidays, missed funerals, survived on cold brew coffee and the very specific satisfaction of finding what other people had tried to hide. Numbers, in my experience, never lie. People lie. Numbers just hold the evidence until someone patient enough comes looking. I remember the exact moment I met him. I was at a gallery opening in Tribeca, dragged there by my closest friend Margot, who ran a small art advisory firm and believed, passionately and incorrectly, that I needed to be seen somewhere that isn't a deposition room. I didn't want to be there. My heels were new and already a mistake. The wine was warm, and I was quietly calculating how soon I could leave without offending anyone when someone across the room said my name. Not excuse me. Not hey. Name. Precisely. Severine. I turned around, and there he was, Cashin Ward, 36 years old, founder and CEO of Ward Capital Group, a private equity and real estate development firm that had reshaped significant portions of the Manhattan and Chicago skylines in the past decade. He was tall, dark-haired, with a kind of unhurried confidence that doesn't come from money alone but from a lifetime of knowing that rooms tend to rearrange themselves around you. He smiled. And his eyes, gray, slightly amused, disconcertingly direct, had the quality of making you feel like he had already read everything about you and found it interesting. Severine Ashworth, he said. You dismantled the Hartfield Group's offshore structure 2 years ago and handed the SEC the cleanest case they'd had in a decade. I've been wanting to meet you. I stared at him. Of all the opening lines I had braced myself for, that was not one of them. You follow forensic accounting. Yes. I follow exceptional people, he said simply. My friend Margot told me later that she watched something shift in my expression in that moment, like a key finding its lock after years of searching. She said it frightened her, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. I wish I had listened to that fear. But how do you listen to a feeling that hasn't yet learned to speak? How do you step back from a man who looks at you like you are the most compelling thing in every room he has ever entered? Don't. You walk straight into the fire, convinced, absolutely convinced that you are the exception, that you are the one person sharp enough, careful enough, loved enough not to get burned. Cashin and I had our first official date 10 days later. Dinner at a restaurant in the West Village where you needed to know someone to get a reservation, and the lighting was the kind that made everyone look like they were being filmed. He was extraordinary company, razor-sharp, genuinely curious, and possessed of a quality that was almost startling in someone of his stature. He listened. Not the hollow, performative listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak. Real listening. The kind where they remember something you mentioned once, in passing 3 weeks later, and bring it back like a small found object offered with open hands. He remembered that I took my coffee with a single shot of espresso, no sugar. He remembered that I had a younger brother named Fox who was doing his residency at Johns Hopkins, and that I wore my worry about him like a second skin. He remembered that I had always wanted to see the northern lights over Iceland, specifically in February, because I had read that February was the darkest and therefore the most spectacular. I fell in love with him the way people fall off cliffs, in stages. First the leaning, then the tipping, Then the terrifying, exhilarating freefall, when it's already too late to do anything but hope the landing doesn't kill you. By month 3, I had met his mother, a formidable woman named Eleanor Ward, who spent half the year in Greenwich and the other half in Palm Beach and regarded most people with the warm reception of a museum curator assessing a piece whose provenance she doubted. She seemed, improbably, to find me acceptable. Possibly because I was the only woman Cashin had brought home who hadn't immediately tried to ingratiate herself. I was too tired from 60-hour workweeks to perform anything, and she seemed to respect that. By month 6, I had my own drawer at his Upper East Side townhouse. By month 10 he had proposed. The ring was extraordinary, an emerald-cut diamond flanked by 2 tapered baguettes, set in platinum. He proposed in Reykjavik in February under the northern lights, which turned the sky above us into something that didn't look real, great curtains of green and violet light rippling like the aurora was alive. I cried so hard my breath fogged in the cold air. Said yes. Course I said yes. And for the first few months of our engagement, life was everything I had always worked toward and quietly believed was possible if you were disciplined enough, brave enough, present enough to let another person all the way in. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April, everything changed. It started with a receipt. A meaningless piece of paper, tucked inside the inner pocket of a blazer I had pulled from the dry cleaning bag to hang in the closet. I almost didn't look at it. I almost just set it on the dresser. But the name on the receipt caught my eye. Not a restaurant I recognized, not in any neighborhood I knew he frequented. A small hotel in the West 50s. A room charge. A date stamp from a Tuesday 3 weeks prior, when Cashin had told me he was in Chicago for a board meeting. I stood there with that receipt in my hand for a very long time. I want to be precise about what happened in my mind in that moment. It was not panic. It was not even grief, not yet. It was something colder and more precise. The specific clinical focus that takes over when I find an anomaly in a financial report. The trained instinct of a woman who had spent her entire career recognizing when a number doesn't belong. This number didn't belong. Put the receipt back. I said nothing. I went to work. And I started paying attention. 2 weeks later. A name that appeared twice in the same week in the background of 2 separate photos he'd been tagged in at public events. Woman. Professionally dressed. The kind of careful, deliberate not standing too close that only looks natural to people who don't know what proximity management looks like from the outside. I knew what it looked like from the outside. A month after that. A phone call he took in the garage at 11 at night, the murmur of his voice filtering under the door, going quiet when he heard me on the stairs. The crack, once it appeared, did not stop growing. Her name, when I finally found it, was Isolde Crane. 33 years old. Director of Strategic Partnerships at a major Manhattan hedge fund. Educated at Dartmouth and Wharton. Elegant in that particular American way that looks effortless because enormous amounts of effort went into making it appear so. I found her through a chain of deduction that I will spare you in its entirety, but which ended with a photograph, taken at a fundraising dinner 6 months before Cashin and I met, in which they were seated together at the same table. His hand resting on the back of her chair in a posture of proprietary ease. 6 months before we met. That was the detail that transformed grief into something else entirely. Because it meant the timeline didn't start with me. It meant I had arrived mid-story, without being told I was a supporting character in someone else's narrative. I sat with this for 5 days. 5 days of going to work, building cases for other people's frauds, coming home, having dinner, lying in the dark beside a man I loved with a ferocity that now felt like the cruelest joke the universe had ever made at my expense. On the 5th evening, Cashin poured 2 glasses of wine, handed me one and said with complete and effortless ease, "I love you, Severine. I don't think I say it enough." I looked at him, smiled. "You do," I said. And I decided right then and there, in that beautiful townhouse kitchen with its sub-zero refrigerator and its marble countertops and its view of the amber-lit street below, I decided that I was not going to confront him. Not yet. Not until I knew everything. Because Severine Ashworth had not built a career finding hidden truths by being impulsive. And the man who had just told me he loved me, smooth, assured, already reaching for his phone, had made the most consequential mistake of his life. He had underestimated me. What I discovered over the following 19 months would have destroyed a lesser person. I say that not with pride, but with the exhausted honesty of someone who had to become something new in order to survive something they never anticipated. I hired a private investigator named Dex Callahan, a former federal agent who had pivoted to private work and approached every case with the dispassionate efficiency of someone who had seen everything twice. Dex did not offer sympathy. Dex found facts. The first fact: Isolde Crane was not a casual distraction or a recent lapse in judgment. She and Cashin had been together, in the functional sense of the word, for over 3 years. Their relationship predated mine by 6 months. She was, in the most unambiguous terms, the primary. I had been the secondary. I had been chosen, deliberately it would become clear, for reasons that had nothing to do with love. The second fact arrived like a second floor collapsing onto the first. Ward Capital Group was not the solid, prestigious empire it appeared to be. In the past 4 years, Cashin had leveraged the firm's reputation to attract over $300 million in investment capital. Much of it from individual investors, family offices, and smaller institutional players who trusted the Ward name. That capital was supposed to be funding a portfolio of premium real estate development projects across 5 major cities. What it was actually funding was a great deal more complicated and a great deal more criminal. Dex obtained, through sources I chose not to interrogate, internal communications that revealed a pattern of systematic misrepresentation. Development projects that existed on paper but were years behind schedule, obscured by falsified progress reports. Fees being extracted at a rate that would render most of the funds insolvent within 18 months. And a secondary financial structure, a web of LLCs and offshore holding companies, that was being used to quietly siphon investor capital into accounts controlled, ultimately by Cashin personally. It was securities fraud. Wire fraud. It was, in the language I knew professionally better than any other, a slow-motion Ponzi structure with enough layers of legitimacy built around it to survive casual scrutiny. I sat with this information for 2 weeks before I fully absorbed what it meant. Because here is what it also meant. Cashin had sought me out deliberately. A forensic accountant with a high-profile reputation, newly made partner at one of the city's most respected firms. As his fiancée, I was both a resource and a shield. My association lent him credibility. And there had been moments, I now understood with a cold and sickening clarity, where I had been subtly, carefully guided toward reviewing certain subsidiary structures in ways that had made those structures appear legitimate to outside scrutiny. I hadn't just been deceived romantically. I had been used professionally. I had been a tool in the construction of a fraud I would have spent my career dismantling. The rage that arrived with this realization was unlike anything I had ever felt. Clean and absolute like a blade. Not hot. Cold. The coldest thing I had ever experienced. I opened my laptop. Began building a file. Everything I could legitimately access, and some things I accessed through channels my attorney would later describe, diplomatically, as creative but defensible. I documented, organized, encrypted, and backed up to 4 separate locations. And then I did something that still surprises me. I reached out to Isolde Crane. We met at a coffee shop in the Flatiron District on a Wednesday afternoon. I got there early and chose a table in the corner with a view of the door. Old habits. She walked in and I had a moment, just a moment, of something irrational and human. She was beautiful in a controlled, precise way. And for 1 second I understood purely and involuntarily the pull. Then the second passed and I was myself again. Clear-eyed, purposeful, focused. She saw me and stopped. She worked out the situation with the rapid efficiency of someone who built strategies for a living. Then she sat down. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "I know about you," I said. "I know about all of it. And I'm not here to fight with you." She studied me carefully. "Then why are you here?" "Because I think he's been lying to both of us," I said. "And I think you might already know that." I watched something shift in her expression. She was good at controlling her face. But I was better at reading the tiny failures of control. "He told you I was temporary," I said. "It wasn't a question. That the engagement was a business necessity. For optics. For investors. That you were the one he actually wanted. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He's very gifted, I said quietly, at giving each person exactly the version of the story that keeps them in place. Isolde looked at me for a long time with the assessing gaze of a woman who had learned never to trust anything that came toward her without a clear angle. Then she reached into her bag and set a folder on the table. I've been his silent legal advisor on 3 of the offshore structures, she said. He told me they were standard tax optimization. 2 months ago, he asked me to sign a document that would make me directly liable if those structures were ever investigated. My blood went cold. Did you sign it? No, was. And I made copies of everything before I refused. She slid the folder across the table. I looked at it. I looked at her. And in that moment, 2 women in a coffee shop in Manhattan on a Wednesday afternoon, connected by nothing except the same man's deception, something shifted between us. Not warmth exactly. Not friendship. Something more honest and more durable than either. A shared understanding that the only way out of this was through, and that going through it alone was a choice neither of us had to make. When? She asked. The wedding, I said. We wait until the wedding. She was quiet for a moment. That's cruel, she said. Yes, I agreed. It is. She picked up her coffee. What do you need from me? The next 7 months were the most demanding of my life. Not because of the preparation, though the preparation was vast and intricate and consumed the margins of every day. It was demanding in a quieter, more corrosive way, because it required me to continue being, in every visible respect, the woman Cashin Ward thought he was marrying. The woman who didn't know. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained performance. Not acting, exactly. More like the continuous low-level effort of keeping 2 versions of reality running simultaneously in the same body. The Severine who smiled over dinner and discussed wedding venues and tasted cake samples and laughed at his stories. And the Severine who was, beneath all of it, quietly, methodically taking him apart. The worst moments were the ones that felt real. Because here is the thing about deeply intelligent men who are capable of profound deception. They are also, sometimes, genuinely wonderful. Cashin had a way of being present with me that felt like nothing I had experienced before or since. On Sunday mornings he would read the paper aloud. The weird stories, the unexpected ones, the ones he knew would make me laugh, in a voice that was warm and unhurried and completely at ease. And I would sit across from him and feel the pull of it. The pull of wanting it to be real. Of choosing the beautiful, constructed version over the ugly true one. And then I would remember the receipt. The offshore structures. The $300 million. The ordinary people whose retirement savings were dissolving, slowly and invisibly, into accounts with his name on them. And I would come back to myself. The wedding was planned for the 2nd Saturday in October. St. Patrick's Cathedral was not available. Cashin's mother had tried. So the ceremony was booked at the Riverside Church on the Upper West Side, which was arguably more beautiful anyway. The reception would follow at a landmark hotel in Midtown. 420 guests, including, seated carefully and inconspicuously throughout the church, 2 SEC investigators attending as +1s of genuine guests. A journalist from a major financial publication who had been investigating Ward Capital Group for 11 months without the documentation she needed. Isolde seated near the back, with a laptop connected to the church's AV system, which had been upgraded, at the bride's request, to include 2 large projection screens for the ceremony slideshow. My attorney had spent 3 months ensuring that what we were doing was not only satisfying but legally immaculate. The evidence package had been structured so that the delivery of copies to the SEC, combined with the simultaneous publication of the journalist's story, would trigger an immediate investigative response that could not be quietly buried. The night before the ceremony, Cashin held my face in his hands in the hallway of his townhouse and looked at me for a long moment with an expression so tender it almost broke something in me. Tomorrow, he said, I get to spend the rest of my life with the most remarkable woman I have ever known. I looked at him, and I thought about all the versions of him that existed simultaneously. The man who meant that, the man who had used me, the man who had stolen from hundreds of people, the man who could hold 2 entire lives in his hands and feel no apparent contradiction. Me too, I said softly. I did not sleep that night. October in New York can be transcendent. The morning of my wedding was exactly that. Cold blue sky, the trees along Riverside Drive in full amber and copper fire. The kind of morning that makes you understand why people stay in this city through everything it puts them through. My friend Margot did my hair. She talked the whole time, filling the silence the way she always did, and I loved her for it. My mother called from Oregon and wept happily. My brother Fox, his Hopkins residency having granted him exactly 48 hours off, straightened my veil and looked at me with a specific expression of a younger sibling who has always trusted you completely and is trusting you now. I stood in the dressing room and looked at myself in the mirror. White dress. A column of silk crepe that had taken 4 fittings to get right. The emerald-cut diamond on my finger. A bouquet of ivory peonies, their stems wrapped in ribbon. And in my right hand, barely visible, the flash drive. I had rehearsed this moment so many times. In some versions I felt powerful. In others I felt like the architect of something I couldn't fully control and wasn't sure I had the right to set in motion. Standing here in the actual moment, I felt neither of those things. I felt something quieter and stranger. Like a woman who had already made the only decision available to her, and was now simply walking toward its consequence. The church was breathtaking. The ceiling soaring. The light through the windows, that particular quality of amber and gold that makes you feel like you are inside something sacred. Cashin stood at the altar in a charcoal suit. He watched me walk the aisle with an expression of absolute, unguarded wonder. And whatever else he was, whatever the full truth of him amounted to, in that moment he was real. The feeling was real. I know it because I felt it too, moving through me like a current. That terrible, complicated love for a person who had turned out to be someone you couldn't keep. I reached him. He took my hands. The officiant began. We got to the vows. Cashin spoke his. Carefully crafted, specific, genuinely moving. He said my name in a way that landed in the room like a note held too long. Several people in the front rows, pressed fingers to their eyes. Then it was my turn. I looked at him. He was smiling. Waiting. I said, in a voice that was very calm and very clear. Cashin, before I speak these vows, there's something our guests need to see. The church went absolutely still. His smile didn't move at first. It held suspended while his mind caught up. And then, slowly, in degrees, it dissolved. He nodded. Behind 420 people, Isolde pressed play. The screens on either side of the altar, which everyone present had assumed would display photographs of a love story, instead displayed a spreadsheet, a series of wire transfer records. Then an audio clip. Cashin's voice, unmistakable, unhurried, instructing a business associate in clinical detail how to reclassify misappropriated investor funds as development overhead. The silence in that church was unlike any silence I had ever experienced. The specific silence of 400 people processing something that does not fit inside the category of events they came prepared for. Cashin turned to the screens. And I watched something happen to his face. Not anger. Not the explosive, defensive rage I had half expected. Something quieter and more total. The careful collapse of a man who has spent years being the person who holds all the cards, realizing, in one irreversible moment, that the deck was not what he thought it was. He turned back to me. Severine. The SEC liaisons in rows 9 and 14 already have the full documentation, I said. The story publishes in 20 minutes. A long silence. You wouldn't. His voice was very low. Cashin. I held his gaze. Finding what people hide is the only thing I have ever been better at than loving you. From the second row I heard a sound. His mother, Eleanor Ward. Sitting perfectly upright in her pale gray dress, hands folded in her lap, crying. Not from grief, I would later think. From something more complicated. The specific devastation of a woman who raised someone and is watching the final account come due. I set the bouquet on the altar rail. I looked at the ring for a moment. Platinum, emerald cut, Reykjavik. And then I set it down beside the peonies. And I walked out of the Riverside Church into the amber October morning. The story broke 19 minutes later. By noon, Ward Capital Group's accounts had been frozen. By evening, Cashin's photograph was on the front page of every financial news platform in the country. By the end of the week, the SEC had announced a formal investigation. By the end of the month, the DOJ had joined it. The trial took 22 months. I will not walk you through every hour of it. What matters is that the evidence was sufficient, more than sufficient, and the verdict when it came reflected that. Cashin Ward was convicted on 14 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and investment advisor fraud. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. A restitution fund was established for defrauded investors. It was not everything. It was not nothing. I want to tell you what happened to me. The first month after the wedding was the strangest of my life. When you have spent 19 months in a state of sustained, purposeful focus, planning, documenting, preparing, and then the moment you've prepared for arrives and passes, the silence afterward is almost physical, like a frequency that was always in the background suddenly going off. I had nothing left to plan, nowhere to aim the focus. I went back to my apartment, not the one I had been sharing with Cashin. I had never given up my own place, a one-bedroom in the West Village, because some instinct I couldn't consciously name had told me not to. I had kept paying rent on it through the entire engagement. Margot had called it wasteful. I had called it a hunch. I slept for 11 hours the first night. I spent most of the second day sitting on my kitchen floor, which is where I always end up when I don't know what else to do with myself. My brother Fox called 6 times. On the 7th call I answered, and he flew up from Baltimore and sat with me on that kitchen floor for 4 hours, saying almost nothing, which was exactly right. Isolde Crane took a position at a different firm. We stayed in loose contact, the occasional message, careful and warm in the way of two people who share something significant that resists easy categorization. She sent me a bottle of very good Burgundy when the verdict came down. I sent her a card. We have never spoken about Cashin directly, and I think that is correct. I went back to Callaway Vance, and I found to my surprise that I could. The work had always been mine, separate from him, untouched by what had happened between us. If anything, the experience had made me better at it. More attuned to the specific, practiced architecture of deception. More familiar with the gap between what a person shows and what they are. I was promoted to senior partner 8 months after the verdict. And then, 14 months after the wedding I met someone. His name was Stellan Voss. 41 years old. A federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York who had spent the past several years building financial crime cases against exactly the kind of structures Cashin had constructed. He had not worked the Ward case directly. It had been a different division, but he knew it. He had followed it with the professional attention of someone who understood what it had taken to build. We met at a conference on financial crime enforcement at Columbia Law School. He was on the panel. I was presenting a paper on forensic documentation standards. We disagreed, politely but substantively, in front of an audience of 200 people, about the evidentiary thresholds for offshore structure fraud. Afterward, he found me at the coffee station and said, without preamble, "You were right and I was being intellectually stubborn. I wanted you to know that." I looked at him. He was not conventionally striking, mid-height, dark blonde hair going slightly gray at the temples, the particular tired around the eyes quality of someone who had been working hard cases for a long time. But there was something in his face, an absence of performance, a quality of being entirely what he appeared to be, that stopped me in a way I wasn't expecting. "That's a very unusual thing to say to someone you just met," I said. "I find it saves a lot of time," he said. We had dinner that evening. Then a long walk through Morningside Heights that turned into coffee at midnight that turned into standing on a street corner at 2 in the morning, still talking, the city doing what it does, moving around us, indifferent and electric, while we stood in it like two people who had both been waiting, without knowing it, for a conversation that felt like this. "I know what you did," he said, somewhere around 1 a.m., "what it actually took. Not the version that made the headlines." I looked at him carefully. "People write about it like it was a power move," he said. "I read it differently. I think it was an incredibly lonely thing to carry for almost 2 years." I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said. "It was." He didn't say I'm sorry or you were so brave. The two responses I had learned to dread because of how little they held. He just nodded, as if I had confirmed something he had already understood, and then he asked me what I was working on now and genuinely listened to the answer. I didn't fall in love with him like a cliff. I fell in love with him like a tide, slowly, incrementally, each small moment adding itself to the last until one day I looked up and realized I was somewhere entirely different than I had been, and that I had not once, in all the time it had taken to get here, been afraid. He was patient and hurried, constitutionally, almost stubbornly honest, to the point of occasional social inconvenience, which made me love him more rather than less. And he had a quality that I had stopped believing was real. He did not need me to be anything other than what I actually was. That, I discovered, was the rarest thing. It is now 3 years since the wedding that wasn't. Cashin Ward is serving his sentence at a federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania. The restitution proceedings continue. Most of the investors will recover a meaningful portion of what they lost. My firm, Ashworth Forensic Advisory, has 9 full-time analysts and a waiting list. Margot is godmother to the rescue dog I adopted last spring, which she takes as a grave and sacred responsibility. My brother Fox finished his residency. He is now one of the best cardiologists in Baltimore and still calls me too often, and I still answer every time. And Stellan, patient, direct, impossibly honest Stellan, proposed on a Tuesday morning in my kitchen, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, with no ring yet because he had wanted to ask before he chose it, so we could choose it together. I said yes so fast he laughed. We got married in March. Small ceremony. 22 people. A restaurant in the West Village I had loved for years, closed for the evening, filled with the people who had actually seen us through the years rather than just the occasion. I wore a cream dress. I carried white peonies. No flash drive. I didn't need one. 4 months after the wedding, I received a package at my office. No return address. Postmarked Pennsylvania. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No salutation. No signature. Just a sentence, in handwriting I recognized immediately. The Vantage offshore accounts, the ones that weren't in the original filing. Look at March 2019. You'll find what I protected you from. I sat at my desk for a very long time. Then I called my attorney. Then I looked. And what I found in those March 2019 records stopped me cold, because it showed something I had never seen in 19 months of looking. In March 2019, 14 months before I had ever met Cashin Ward, someone had used his own internal access to quietly, anonymously tip off an SEC risk monitoring system about anomalies in the Vantage Fund. The tip had been too vague to trigger a full investigation, but it existed. Dated. Logged. Undeniably his. He had tried to stop it. Once. Early. Before it had grown into something he either couldn't or chose not to walk back from. I don't know what to do with that. I have sat with it for months. I have turned it over in the dark, in the quiet hours when Stellan is asleep and the city is as close to silent as it ever gets. Some truths don't resolve cleanly. They sit in you. Complicated, unfinished, like a room you return to occasionally and can never quite make sense of. He loved me in whatever way he was capable of love. He used me. He stole from people who trusted him. He tried once, too quietly and too late, to be something better. These things are all true simultaneously. I am still deciding what to do with the information. I may never decide. And some days, not all days but some, I think that sitting with an unanswered question is its own kind of wisdom. The city doesn't care either way. Just keeps moving. And so do I.